"Pretend you know me," I hissed, my fingers locking around the stranger's wrist with a desperate, bruising grip. "Please, just smile and pretend we're together." The man froze, his porcelain coffee cup suspended just an inch from his lips. Across the cramped diner, the rusty bell above the glass door chimed, and a familiar, chilling silhouette stepped into the flickering, neon-lit interior. Mark, my ex. The stranger didn't pull away. Instead, his dark, calculating gaze shifted past my shoulder, locking onto Mark with an icy, terrifying calm. Slowly, with deliberate precision, his hand rotated, his large, calloused fingers enveloping mine. "I know him," the stranger murmured, his voice a dark, velvet rumble that sent a completely different kind of shiver down my spine. "And he knows me." The Midnight Owl Diner was the kind of place that existed out of time, anchored to a forgotten stretch of highway on the edge of the city. It smelled perpetually of burnt coffee, stale grease, and the faint, metallic tang of desperation. For 3 months, it had been my sanctuary. The graveyard shift from 10 at night until 6 in the morning offered a grueling kind of invisibility that I desperately craved. Nobody looked closely at the waitress refilling their cup at 3 in the morning. They looked at their regrets, their phones, or the empty road outside. My name is Zoe, and for the past 90 days, my primary objective in life had been to become a ghost. My feet throbbed against the cracked linoleum behind the counter. I wiped down the laminate surface for the 4th time in an hour, the damp rag squeaking against a stubborn syrup stain. The diner was mostly empty. 2 truck drivers murmured in a corner booth, hunched over plates of heavy eggs and toast. An elderly woman sat at the counter, methodically stirring a cup of tea, lost in whatever memories the swirling liquid conjured. And then there was him. He was sitting in booth 4, the one tucked into the darkest corner of the diner, furthest from the windows. He had been there for an hour, nursing a single cup of black coffee. In the harsh, fluorescent lighting that usually made people look jaundiced and exhausted, he looked entirely self-possessed. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked completely out of place against the cracked red vinyl of the booth. His dark hair was neatly styled, but a few stray strands fell across his forehead, softening a face that was otherwise composed of sharp, uncompromising angles. He hadn't touched the laminated menu. He hadn't looked at his phone. He just sat there, projecting an aura of absolute stillness that was somehow louder than a scream. I picked up the glass coffee pot, the dark liquid sloshing against the sides, and made my way over to him. "More coffee?" I asked, forcing the standard, polite retail smile onto my face. He looked up. His eyes were a startling, pale gray, like the color of winter ice over a deep lake. They didn't just look at me, they seemed to catalog me, stripping away the uniform and the forced smile to read the exhaustion underneath. "Please," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, and remarkably quiet. I poured the coffee, watching the steam curl upward. "Quiet night," I offered, trying to fill the silence. It was a nervous habit. Silence always felt heavy to me now. "The quiet ones usually precede the storm," he replied, his gaze dropping to the fresh, dark liquid in his cup. I gave a small, non-committal laugh, turning away to head back to the safety of the counter. And that was when the bell above the front door chimed. It was a sharp, cheerful sound that violently contrasted with the sudden, absolute terror that spiked through my veins. I knew the silhouette instantly, even through the foggy glass, backlit by the sputtering yellow street lamp outside. The angle of his shoulders, the arrogant tilt of his head, the precise way he pushed the door open, it was seared into my muscle memory. "Mark?" My breath hitched, catching in my throat like a jagged stone. The coffee pot in my hand trembled, the glass clinking faintly against the silver rim. It had been 3 months. 3 months of changing my number, abandoning my apartment, sleeping on a friend's couch before finding this miserable, wonderful diner on the edge of nowhere. 3 months of looking over my shoulder, and now he was here. He was wearing his usual leather jacket, his eyes scanning the diner with the predatory sweep of a hawk looking for a field mouse. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my system. My feet felt glued to the linoleum. The back door. I needed to get to the kitchen and out the back door into the alley. But to get to the kitchen swinging doors, I had to cross the open space right in front of the entrance. He would see me. If I ran, he would chase. He always chased. I was standing right next to booth 4. The man in the charcoal suit. Instinct overrode logic. It was the desperate, flailing instinct of a drowning woman reaching for a piece of driftwood. I didn't think about boundaries or politeness or the insanity of what I was doing. I simply reacted. I spun around, practically collapsing onto the red vinyl bench opposite the stranger. I dropped the coffee pot onto the table miraculously. It didn't shatter, though dark liquid splashed over the rim, staining the white paper placemat. "Pretend you know me," I hissed, my voice a ragged, frantic whisper. I reached across the small table, my fingers locking around his wrist with a desperate bruising grip. His skin was warm, his muscles taut beneath the fabric of his suit sleeve. "Please, just smile and pretend we're together." For a split second, time seemed to halt. The stranger froze, his porcelain coffee cup suspended just an inch from his lips. I expected him to pull away in disgust. I expected him to call for the manager. I expected him to push me away. Across the diner, Mark's heavy boots echoed on the floorboards as he stepped fully inside, the door swinging shut behind him. The stranger didn't pull away. Instead, his dark, calculating gaze shifted past my shoulder, locking onto the front of the diner. I saw the micro-expressions flicker across his face, a brief flash of recognition, followed by a settling of something cold and utterly lethal in his grey eyes. Slowly, with deliberate, unhurried precision, his hand rotated beneath mine. His large, calloused fingers rose, enveloping my trembling hand entirely. His grip was firm, grounding, and undeniably possessive. "I know him," the stranger murmured, leaning forward slightly. His voice was no longer just a rumble, it was a blade sliding out of a velvet sheath. "And he knows me." My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, so loud I was sure it was echoing throughout the diner. I sat frozen, my hand enveloped in the stranger's, my back rigid against the booth. I couldn't turn around. If I turned around, Mark would see my face, see the terror in my eyes, and he would know he had won. Again, but the stranger, his gaze was fixed on the entrance. I watched his face closely, desperate for a cue on how to act. What I saw wasn't the polite confusion of an innocent bystander roped into a domestic dispute. What I saw was a chilling, absolute dominance, his jaw set. The faint, polite mask he had worn moments ago dissolved, replaced by a look of predatory stillness. He wasn't looking at Mark with fear. He was looking at him, the way a butcher looks at a particularly uninteresting slab of meat. "Don't turn around," the stranger said, his voice barely a breath, meant only for me. "Keep your eyes on me, Zoe." I blinked, startled. "How do you know my name?" I whispered back, my voice trembling. He tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "It's printed on the plastic name tag pinned to your apron." I flushed, feeling incredibly foolish. I forced myself to look into his pale grey eyes, trying to mirror the calm he was projecting, though inside I was fracturing into 1,000 pieces. Behind me, the heavy footsteps stopped. The diner went dead quiet. Even the 2 truck drivers in the corner had ceased their murmuring, sensing the sudden, sharp shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. Well, well, Mark's voice rang out, dripping with that familiar, mocking false bravado. It was the voice he used when he was trying to assert control, the voice that usually preceded a thrown plate or a shattered mirror. If it isn't, Mark's voice faltered. It didn't just trail off, it snapped shut, like a book slammed closed mid-sentence. I saw the stranger's eyes narrow slightly. His thumb began to stroke the back of my hand, a gesture that should have been comforting, but felt terrifyingly calculated. "If it isn't who, Mark?" the stranger asked. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his tone commanded the entire room. I heard a sharp intake of breath from behind me, a shuffling of feet. I apologize," Mark stammered. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone from his voice. It was replaced by a thin, reedy tone of genuine, unadulterated panic. I had known Mark for 2 years. I had seen him angry, violent, manipulative, and charming. I had never, not once, heard him sound terrified. I thought, I saw someone else. My mistake. "It seems you make a lot of mistakes lately, Mark," the stranger replied evenly. He finally took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the space behind me. "I suggest you leave before you make another one. One you can't walk away from. Yes? Right? Sorry." The frantic scuffling of boots retreating. The harsh squeak of the diner door being pulled open with too much force. The chime of the bell, ringing wildly. The door slamming shut. Silence rushed back into the diner, thick and suffocating. I let out a breath. I felt like I had been holding for 3 months. My shoulders slumped, and I slumped forward, resting my forehead against my free hand. A wave of nausea washed over me, a byproduct of the massive adrenaline spike crashing through my system. "He's gone," the stranger said quietly. He slowly released my hand. I immediately felt the absence of his warmth. I pulled my hand back, tucking it into my lap, suddenly hyper-aware of how deeply I had intruded into his space. "I'm sorry," I gasped, looking up at him. My vision was slightly blurred with unshed tears of relief and lingering fear. "I am so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. He's a bad person. I was hiding from him." The stranger reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and withdrew a sleek, matte black leather wallet. He extracted a crisp $100 bill and laid it carefully on the table next to the spilled coffee. "You have nothing to apologize for, Zoe," he said, his tone unreadable. He slid out of the booth, his movements fluid and precise. Standing up, he towered over the table, imposing and shadowed. "But I would advise you to find a new place to work. This diner is no longer safe for you." "What?" I looked up at him, bewildered, but he left. "You scared him off. Who are you?" He looked down at me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something akin to pity in those cold gray eyes. "My name is Jackson," he said simply. He buttoned his suit jacket with one hand. "And I didn't scare him, Zoe. I terrified him. Because Mark knows exactly what happens to people who interrupt my coffee." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. He moved with a silent, deadly grace, the heavy door opening and closing with barely a sound. I sat alone in the booth, staring at the $100 bill and the spilled coffee. The lingering scent of his cologne, expensive cedarwood, and something sharp, like ozone before a thunderstorm hung in the air, a phantom presence that felt infinitely more dangerous than the ex-boyfriend I had been running from. I didn't quit the diner. It was easy for a man in a tailored suit dropping $100 bills to tell me to find a new job. It was much harder for a girl with $72 in her checking account and rent due on a dingy sublet to actually do it. I told myself Jackson was just trying to be dramatic. Mark was a bully, a low-level hustler who ran illegal poker games and sold stolen electronics out of the trunk of his car. He was vicious to people smaller than him, but he was a coward at heart. Whoever Jackson was, maybe a high-priced lawyer or a detective, he had intimidated Mark. That was a good thing, right? But as the days bled into a week, the atmosphere around me began to curdle. The air grew thick with a creeping, invisible paranoia that felt like cobwebs brushing against my skin in the dark. It started subtly. 3 nights after the incident, I was walking home from my shift. It was 6:30 a.m., the sky a bruised purple, the city just beginning to stir. I took my usual route through the garment district, a maze of narrow streets lined with locked warehouses and overflowing dumpsters. I heard the sound of an engine idling. A dark, unmarked sedan was parked at the mouth of an alley. As I walked past, the passenger side window glided down. A man was sitting inside, smoking a cigarette. He didn't say a word, but his eyes tracked me as I walked. They weren't the eyes of a catcaller or a mugger. They were the cold, assessing eyes of someone taking inventory. I walked faster, my keys clutched tightly in my fist. The car didn't follow, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like damp clothing all the way to my apartment. The next night, at the diner, things escalated. It was 2 a.m. I was in the back storage room, hauling a 50-pound sack of flour toward the kitchen, my muscles screaming in protest. The back door, heavy steel reinforced with a deadbolt, suddenly rattled violently. Someone was twisting the handle, pulling with immense force. I dropped the flour, a cloud of white dust exploding around my sneakers. I backed away, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from a nearby shelf. The rattling stopped. Then 3 heavy, deliberate knocks. Thud, thud, thud. I held my breath. After a long minute, I crept toward the door and peered through the thick, wire mesh reinforced peephole. There was no one there, but taped to the exterior of the door, right at eye level, was a single playing card, the Jack of Spades. When my manager arrived at 6 a.m., I made him go out back to get it. He ripped it off, grumbling about kids playing pranks, and tossed it in the trash. But I knew Mark. Mark fancied himself a gambler. The Jack of Spades was his calling card when he ran his underground tables. It was his way of saying, I'm still in the game. But the strangest part wasn't the threat itself. It was the method. Mark was loud. If he was mad at me, he would have kicked the door in or waited by my apartment to scream at me. This silent stalking, this slow turn of the screw, it wasn't his style. It felt organized. It felt patient. It felt like someone was trying to flush me out. By Friday night, the exhaustion and fear had worn me down to a frayed wire. Every shadow looked like a man in a suit. Every car engine sounded like a pursuit. I was wiping down the counter, staring blankly at my own reflection in the stainless steel coffee urn, realizing I couldn't live like this. The diner, once my sanctuary, had become a glass box where I was entirely exposed. The bell above the door chimed. I jumped, sloshing coffee onto the counter. I whipped around, expecting to see Mark, or the man from the sedan, or perhaps Jackson himself, returning to collect his change. Instead, 3 men walked in. They didn't look like Mark's usual crew of desperate hustlers. These men were built like brick walls, wearing thick leather jackets that did little to hide the bulk of shoulder holsters beneath. They moved with a terrifying synchronization, ignoring the "Please wait to be seated" sign, walking directly to the center of the diner. The largest of the 3, a man with a thick, jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, looked directly at me. "Are you Zoe?" he asked. His voice was gravel, grating against the silence of the room. My mouth went dry. The 2 truck drivers in the corner suddenly stood up, threw a few crumpled bills on their table, and practically sprinted for the door. They recognized predators when they saw them. "I'm working," I managed to say, taking a step back toward the kitchen doors. The scarred man smiled. It was a terrible, lifeless expression. "We're not here for the pie, sweetheart. We're looking for Mark. He seems to have misplaced something very valuable. And since you're his new insurance policy, we figured you might know where he is." "Insurance policy?" I echoed, my mind racing, stumbling over the words. "I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't seen Mark in months." "We broke up." The man took a slow step forward. "Don't play stupid. We know what happened here Tuesday night. We know who you're sitting with. If you're under Jackson's umbrella, Mark must have given you the ledger. Hand it over, and we walk out of here. Keep playing dumb, and this diner burns to the ground with you inside it." My brain short-circuited. Ledger? Jackson's umbrella? Before I could form a response, before the man could take another step, the glass front door of the diner exploded inward. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a massive, blunt force impact that shattered the tempered glass into thousands of glittering, deadly diamonds. The three men spun around, reaching beneath their leather jackets. Through the rain of falling glass stepped Jackson. He wasn't wearing a suit tonight. He wore a dark Henley shirt that clung to the muscular lines of his chest, and heavy, dark jeans. In his right hand, he held a sleek, silenced pistol. His face was entirely devoid of emotion, a mask of cold, predatory focus. The scene unfolded with a terrifying, fluid violence that felt simultaneously agonizingly slow and brutally fast. The scarred man drew his weapon, opening his mouth to yell an order. Jackson didn't hesitate. He raised his arm and fired twice in rapid succession. Pfft, pfft. The sounds were muffled, like a heavy staple gun, but the impact was devastating. The scarred man's gun dropped from his hands as he crumpled to the linoleum, clutching his knee, screaming in sudden agony. The other two men lunged toward Jackson. Jackson stepped inside the guard of the first man, a blur of motion. He didn't use the gun. He used his elbow, driving it upward into the man's throat with a sickening crunch. As the man gagged and fell, Jackson pivoted smoothly, sweeping the leg of the third man, sending him crashing backward into a table, sending salt shakers and ketchup bottles flying. It was over in less than 10 seconds. 3 massive men, armed and dangerous, were incapacitated on the floor of my diner, groaning in pain. Jackson hadn't even broken a sweat. He stood amidst the wreckage, his gun lowered but still gripped firmly, his gray eyes sweeping the room before locking onto me. I was backed flat against the pie display case, trembling violently, my hands clutching the fabric of my apron like a lifeline. "I told you," Jackson said, his voice entirely calm, cutting through the moans of the men on the floor. "This diner is no longer safe." He walked toward me, stepping over the shattered glass and groaning bodies with casual disdain. He holstered his weapon at the small of his back, the movement practiced and smooth. He reached out, grabbing my upper arm. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was absolute. "We are leaving," he stated. It wasn't a request. "Wait. I can't just my shift the police," I babbled, the adrenaline making my thoughts spiral out of control. Jackson stopped, turning his head slightly to look at me. The intensity in his eyes forced me into silence. "If the police arrive, you will be answering questions about why the Moretti crime family sent 3 enforcers to execute a waitress. Are you prepared to answer those questions, Zoe?" "Moretti crime family." The words tasted absurd in my mouth, like I was suddenly reciting lines from a movie I hadn't auditioned for. "Walk," Jackson commanded, pulling me toward the shattered entrance. I stumbled over the threshold, my sneakers crunching on the broken glass. Outside, a sleek, black-armored SUV was idling at the curb. The rear door was already open. Jackson practically tossed me inside, climbing in right behind me and slamming the heavy door shut. The interior smelled of rich leather and the same sharp ozone scent that clung to him. The driver, a broad-shouldered man wearing sunglasses despite the dark night, put the car in gear. We accelerated away from the diner with enough force to press me back against the plush leather seat. I sat huddled in the corner, staring at Jackson. He was staring out the tinted window, watching the city blur past, his profile sharp against the passing streetlights. "What is happening?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "Who are you? What did they mean about an umbrella? And a ledger?" Jackson turned his head slowly. He looked at me for a long time, evaluating me, weighing my ignorance against whatever truth he held. "You," he said softly, the danger in his voice wrapped in velvet, made a very impulsive decision on Tuesday night. By grabbing my hand, you signaled to Mark that you were under my protection, and in doing so, you inadvertently declared war on half the criminal syndicate in this city. My breath caught. "I don't understand. Mark owes a substantial amount of money to very dangerous people," Jackson explained, his tone clinical. "He stole something from me to pay them off. When he saw you holding my hand, he assumed you had betrayed him to me. He assumed I was using you to get to him. He panicked, and he ran to his other creditors, telling them you had the item he stole." The reality of the situation crashed over me like a freezing wave. My desperate, tiny act of survival in the diner had been misinterpreted as a massive move on a chessboard I didn't even know existed. "But I don't have anything," I cried, panic rising in my throat. "I don't know anything about a ledger. I just wanted him to leave me alone." "I know that," Jackson said quietly, "but they don't. And right now, to them, you are the most valuable asset in the city. Which means, Zoe, until we find Mark and retrieve what he stole." He leaned closer, the shadows in the car masking his features, leaving only the gleam of his pale eyes. "You belong to me." The SUV glided into the subterranean parking garage of a gleaming glass skyscraper downtown. We bypassed the standard elevators, Jackson scanning a heavily encrypted keycard to access a private lift that shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. The digital counter stopped at the 50th floor, penthouse. When the doors chimed and slid open, I stepped out into a world that felt entirely alien. The apartment was massive, a study in minimalist luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the city skyline, a sea of glittering lights stretching into the darkness. The floors were polished dark wood, the furniture sleek, sharp angles of chrome, black leather, and gray suede. It was impeccably clean, brutally expensive, and utterly devoid of anything resembling warmth or personal touch. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a high-altitude observation deck for a predator. "Make yourself comfortable," Jackson said, shrugging off his Henley to reveal a stark white undershirt that highlighted the heavy bands of muscle across his shoulders. He threw the shirt onto a leather armchair and walked toward a massive marble kitchen island. "There are clothes in the guest bedroom down the hall to the left. Bathroom is attached. You should wash the glass out of your hair." I reached up, touching my head, wincing as my fingers brushed against tiny shards of grit. I felt numb. The terror of the diner had faded into a deep, vibrating shock. I was standing in the penthouse of a Mafia boss, having just been rescued or kidnapped. The line was blurring from 3 armed hitmen. I moved mechanically. I found the guest bedroom. It was larger than my entire apartment, dominated by a king-sized bed with crisp white linens. In the closet, I found a row of women's clothes, sweaters, leggings, soft cotton t-shirts, all in neutral colors, all with the tags still attached. I ignored the implications of a wardrobe waiting for a stranger and grabbed the simplest things I could find. In the bathroom, under the scalding spray of a rainfall shower, I finally let myself cry. I cried for my lost quiet life at the diner. I cried from the sheer, overwhelming terror of the men with guns. And I cried because I knew, deep down, that my life was never going to be normal again. When I emerged, dressed in an oversized cashmere sweater and soft leggings, Jackson was sitting at the kitchen island. He had a glass of amber liquid in his hand and a sleek laptop open in front of him. He looked up as I entered. "Better?" he asked. I walked over, pulling out a heavy chrome stool and sitting as far away from him as the island permitted. "I'm a hostage in a penthouse," I said, my voice hoarse. I wouldn't say better is the right word. Jackson took a slow sip of his drink. "You're not a hostage, Zoe. You are under my protection. Protection from the people who are trying to kill me because they think I'm working for you," I shot back, a flash of anger cutting through my fear. "You realize this is entirely your fault, right? If you hadn't played along in the diner." "If I hadn't played along in the diner," Jackson interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, "Mark would have dragged you out the back door by your hair. I saw the way he looked at you. I saw the terror in your eyes. I intervened to save your life. The consequences are unfortunate, but they are preferable to the alternative." I fell silent, staring down at the marble countertop. He was right. I knew what Mark was capable of. I had the faded bruises to prove it. "Who are you, really?" I asked softly, looking up at him. "You said Mark stole from you. What are you? Some kind of gangster?" Jackson closed the laptop with a soft snap. He turned his chair slightly to face me fully. Under the soft pendant lighting of the kitchen, he looked less like an executioner and more like a weary king. "My family controls certain logistical networks in this city," Jackson said, choosing his words with deliberate care. "Shipping, imports, localized distribution. We operate in the gray areas of commerce. 3 months ago, Mark managed to intercept a very specific digital ledger. It contains routing numbers, offshore accounts, and the identities of several key partners. It is worth roughly $3 million to my competitors. More importantly, it threatens the stability of my organization, and Mark thought he could just sell it back to you?" "Mark is a rat," Jackson said, the disdain in his voice palpable. He panicked. He hid it, tried to broker a deal with the Moretti family, the men who visited your diner tonight, to buy his way into their ranks using my property. But Mark is incompetent. He lost his nerve, went into hiding. Until Tuesday night. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the marble. "When he saw you with me, he thought you were the leak. He thought you led me to him. Now the Morettis believe you know where the ledger is. They want it. I want it back. And until I have it, they will not stop hunting you to get it." I absorbed the impossible weight of his words. $3 million. Crime families. Digital ledgers. It was a language I didn't speak. A world I didn't want any part of. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Do I just live in this tower forever?" Jackson's eyes softened. Just a fraction. It was a fleeting glimpse of humanity beneath the armor. "No," he said quietly. "I am going to find Mark. I am going to retrieve what is mine. And then I am going to make sure the Moretti family understands that you are off limits. Permanently." "And how are you going to do that?" Jackson picked up his glass, finishing the amber liquid in one smooth motion. When he looked back at me, the softness was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, metallic stare of a man who dealt in violence. "I'm going to do what I do best, Zoe," he said softly. "I'm going to start a fire." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological torture. The physical threat was kept at bay by reinforced steel doors, security cameras, and the constant, silent presence of Jackson's men in the hallways below. But the mental toll of being trapped in the gilded cage was profound. I paced the length of the penthouse until my feet ached. I watched the news, hoping for some mention of the diner, but there was nothing. No reports of broken glass or injured men. It was as if the violence had been swallowed whole by the city, erased from existence by people with enough money and power to make truth entirely subjective. Jackson was a ghost in his own home. He left early in the mornings, returning late at night. When he was there, he was tethered to his phone, speaking in low, rapid Italian or clipped English, negotiating, threatening, directing an invisible army. We existed in a state of high-tension orbit. We shared the space, but we didn't touch. We rarely spoke unless necessary. Yet, I was hyper-aware of his every movement. I noticed the way he meticulously cleaned his handgun at the kitchen island. I noticed the dark circles under his pale eyes that spoke of profound sleep deprivation. I noticed the way he always positioned himself between me and the windows, a subconscious act of shielding. He was a monster by society's standards, a criminal, a killer, but in the quiet moments, watching him brew coffee with the exact same precision he used to load a magazine, I saw the immense, crushing weight of the world he carried. He was a prisoner of his own making, just as trapped in his life of violence as I was currently trapped in his penthouse. On the evening of the third day, the fragile stalemate broke. I was sitting on the suede sofa, staring blankly at a muted television, when my burner phone, the one I had bought specifically to avoid, Mark buzzed violently on the coffee table. I stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. Very few people had that number. Jackson had strictly forbidden me from turning it on, warning that it could be traced. But in a moment of desperate isolation, I had powered it up, just wanting to feel connected to the outside world. It buzzed again. An incoming text message. My hand trembled as I reached out and tapped the screen. The message was from an unknown number. It contained a single image and one line of text. The image made my blood run cold. It was a photograph taken from across the street of a small yellow brick house with a front porch swing. My mother's house in the suburbs. The timestamp in the corner of the photo indicated it had been taken less than an hour ago. The text below read, "I know you have Jackson's ear. Tell him to back off his dogs, or the next picture I send is from inside the living room. M." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the glass table. I couldn't breathe. The walls of the penthouse suddenly felt like they were closing in, crushing my ribs. Mark wasn't hiding. He was lashing out. He was going after the only thing in the world I cared about. The front door to the penthouse clicked open. Jackson walked in, shedding his suit jacket, looking exhausted. He stopped halfway across the living room, instantly registering the terror radiating from me. "What happened?" he demanded, his fatigue vanishing in an instant, replaced by sharp alertness. I pointed a shaking finger at the phone. Jackson crossed the room in 2 strides, snatching the device from the table. He read the message, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched near his temple. The silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't the calm silence of control. It was the pressurized silence before an explosion. "He's watching my mother," I choked out, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. "Jackson, you said you were going to handle him. You said you were going to protect me. He's going to hurt her because of me." Jackson didn't yell. He didn't throw the phone. He carefully placed it back on the table, his movements terrifyingly precise. He turned to me, his pale eyes blazing with an arctic fury. "He will not touch her," Jackson said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded absolute belief. "I have men en route to her house right now. They will secure the perimeter. She will not even know they are there, but she will be perfectly safe." "How can you know that?" I screamed, standing up, the fear converting rapidly into desperate anger. "He's unpredictable. He's a coward. And cowards do terrible things when they're cornered. He thinks I'm working with you. He thinks I betrayed him. You did not betray him. Jackson stepped closer, dominating my space, forcing me to look up at him. You survived him. There is a difference. It doesn't matter what the truth is, I yelled, pushing against his solid chest, though it was like trying to move a brick wall. It matters what he believes. And because of what happened in that diner, he believes I'm the enemy. I am the bait. I stopped pushing, dropping my hands to my sides, exhausted by the surge of adrenaline. I looked up into Jackson's face, searching for a way out, a solution in the harsh angles of his features. And in that moment of despair, a terrifying, reckless idea sparked in my mind. The narrative engine of my survival shifted gears. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the one thing Mark wanted. I was the leverage. You've been trying to find him for 3 days, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, the tears stopping. You're shaking down his contacts, kicking in doors, and he's just slipping deeper underground. He's too scared of you to show his face. Jackson narrowed his eyes, sensing the shift in my tone. What are you saying, Zoe? I took a deep breath, swallowing the bile of fear in my throat. I looked directly into the eyes of a Mafia boss and made a deal with the devil. I'm saying, I stated firmly, that he won't come out for you, but he will come out for me. Jackson's reaction was immediate and absolute. No, absolutely not. He turned away from me, pacing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city as if the answer to his problems was written in the neon lights below. You are a civilian. You are not a piece of bait on a hook. I am already the bait, I argued, following him across the room. He threatened my mother, Jackson. I can't just sit in this glass tower and wait for him to make a mistake. If we don't end this now, on our terms, he will hurt someone I love. I won't allow that. Jackson spun around, his presence overwhelming. You have no idea what you are suggesting. You don't know the parameters of an extraction. You don't know how to handle yourself in a crossfire. If Mark gets his hands on you, he won't hesitate to use you as a human shield against me. I will not put you in the line of fire. You already did, I reminded him quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. When you grabbed my hand in the diner, you used me to intimate him. Now, let me use myself to trap him. Jackson stared at me, his jaw locked. I could see the conflict raging behind his icy eyes. The ruthless tactician warring with a strange protective code he seemed to harbor for me. What's the play? He finally asked, his voice tight. I exhaled, my hands trembling as I outlined the desperate plan forming in my head. He wants you to back off. He thinks I have influence over you. I text him back. I tell him I'm terrified, that you're holding me hostage, that I want out. I tell him I know where you keep your most sensitive files, the physical backups, and that I can steal them if he helps me escape the city. He won't believe you have access to my physical assets, Jackson countered. He's arrogant, Jackson. He underestimates women. He always has. He'll believe that a terrified waitress managed to snoop around her captor's apartment. He'll see it as his ultimate payday. He gets the leverage against you, and he gets his revenge on me. And where does this exchange happen? Somewhere public. Somewhere he feels he has an escape route, but where you have total control. Jackson remained silent for a long, agonizing minute. He walked to the kitchen island, leaning heavily against the marble, his head bowed. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable, a mask forged from cold iron. Pier 42, he said softly. It's an abandoned shipping terminal on the East River. It's an open space, plenty of sightlines. He'll like it because he can see anyone approaching. I like it because I own the Port Authority. I can place my men in every elevated position without him ever knowing. He walked back toward me, stopping inches away. He reached out, his large hands gently cupping my face. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones. His touch was unexpectedly tender, a stark contrast to the violence he orchestrated. "If we do this," Jackson said, his voice a low, rough whisper, "you must follow my instructions exactly. If I tell you to drop, you drop. If I tell you to run, you run. You do not hesitate. Do you understand me, Zu?" I looked into his pale gray eyes, seeing the genuine fear he held for my safety. "I understand." "Text him," Jackson commanded, dropping his hands. "Tell him the exchange is tomorrow night at midnight. Pier 42. I picked up the burner phone. My fingers flew across the screen, crafting the lie that would either buy my freedom or sign my death warrant. I hit send. The reply came 3 minutes later. "Midnight. Come alone. If I see even a shadow of Jackson's men, I send the boys to your mother's house. Don't play me, Zoe." I showed the screen to Jackson. He read it, his eyes narrowing to slits. "He won't see my men," Jackson promised, his voice dripping with lethal intent. "And he will never see me coming." The air at Pier 42 tasted of salt, decaying kelp, and industrial rust. The midnight fog had rolled in off the river, thick and heavy, swallowing the city skyline behind us and turning the massive, rusted shipping containers into looming, geometric ghosts. The only light came from the sickly yellow halo of a single, flickering halogen lamp mounted on a dilapidated warehouse. I stood directly beneath it, shivering violently beneath a heavy wool coat Jackson had provided. The cold was biting, but the trembling was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I clutched a thick manila folder to my chest, a prop filled with blank printer paper, designated as the files. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The silence of the pier was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic slapping of the dark water against the concrete pylons. "He's watching," Jackson's voice echoed in my mind, replaying the instructions he had given me in the SUV 10 minutes ago. "Act scared. You don't have to fake it. Let him feel powerful. Draw him into the light." I didn't have to fake it. I was terrified. Even knowing that Jackson and heavily armed men were hidden somewhere in the impenetrable darkness above and around me, I felt entirely exposed. A shadow detached itself from the gloom between two towering stacks of shipping containers. I gasped, taking a step backward. Mark stepped into the pool of yellow light. He looked terrible. The swagger was gone, replaced by a twitchy, feral paranoia. He hadn't shaved in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and his leather jacket looked slept in. He held his right hand tucked inside his jacket, gripping something concealed. "You actually came," Mark sneered, his voice echoing wetly in the fog. He didn't look at me. His eyes were darting frantically, scanning the darkness, searching the rooftops. "I didn't think you had the guts." "I brought what you wanted," I said, my voice shaking perfectly. I held up the manila folder. "Now tell your men to leave my mother alone and give me the money to get out of the city, like you promised." Mark let out a harsh, barking laugh. It sounded brittle and unhinged. "You really think I brought cash for you, Zoe? You think this was a negotiation?" He pulled his hand from his jacket, revealing a heavy, black, semi-automatic pistol. He pointed it directly at my chest. "Toss the folder on the ground and kick it over," he ordered, his hand trembling slightly. "Then turn around and get on your knees." My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't the plan. He was supposed to take the folder and run. He wasn't supposed to execute me. The panic was no longer an act. It was a cold, suffocating reality. "Mark, please," I begged, the tears coming freely now. "I did what you asked. I betrayed him for you. Just let me go." "You betrayed me first," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. You grabbed his hand. You laughed at me in that diner. You think you can play with the big boys, Zoe? You're just a waitress. He stepped closer, the gun unwavering. Drop the folder. Now, I slowly bent down, placing the manila folder onto the wet concrete. I stood back up, my hands raised defensively. I looked past Mark, desperately searching the shadows for any sign of Jackson. Nothing, just fog and darkness. Now, Mark sneered, closing the distance until he was only 5 feet away. Get on your knees. If I tell you to drop, you drop. The memory of Jackson's command flashed in my mind. I didn't get on my knees. I simply collapsed my legs, dropping flat onto my stomach against the freezing, wet concrete, covering the back of my head with my arms. It happened simultaneously. The distinct, suppressed thwip of a sniper rifle cut through the fog from high above. A fraction of a second later, Mark's gun exploded in his hand, the metal shattering into fragments as a high-caliber round obliterated the weapon and 2 of his fingers. Mark screamed a high, piercing sound of agony and shock. He staggered backward, clutching his ruined, bloody hand against his chest. Before he could process what had happened, a shadow detached itself from the top of the nearest shipping container. Jackson dropped 20 feet to the ground, landing with the silent, terrifying grace of a predator. He didn't hesitate. He closed the distance to Mark in 3 massive strides. Mark tried to turn and run, but Jackson caught him by the back of the neck, his fingers digging into nerve clusters. He drove Mark face first into the rusted steel of a container with a sickening crunch of cartilage. Mark slumped, half-conscious, groaning in pain. Jackson pinned him there with one forearm against his throat, pressing a sleek pistol to Mark's temple. "The ledger." "Mark," Jackson said. His voice wasn't loud. It was barely above a whisper, but it carried a promise of absolute, inescapable violence. "Where is it?" "Locker. 402. Central Station," Mark choked out, blood bubbling from his shattered nose. "The key is in my shoe. Please, don't kill me." Jackson's expression didn't change. He didn't look angry or vindictive. He looked entirely indifferent, which was infinitely more terrifying. He reached down, expertly extracted a small brass key from the lining of Mark's boot, and pocketed it. "You brought a gun to a meeting with a civilian," Jackson said softly, leaning his weight against Mark's windpipe. "You threatened her mother. You made this personal." "Jackson, stop." I didn't know I was going to scream it until the words tore from my throat. I pushed myself up off the concrete, my knees bruised, my hands scraped. Jackson paused, turning his head slightly to look at me over his shoulder. "He's beaten," I pleaded, walking slowly toward them, my voice trembling but firm. "You have what you need. You have the ledger. Don't do this. Don't execute him in front of me." Jackson stared at me. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was Mark's ragged, wet breathing and the slop of the river. I saw the conflict in Jackson's eyes. In his world, a betrayal like Mark's demanded blood. Letting him live was a weakness. But as he looked at me, shivering in the fog, covered in dirt and terror, something shifted in his expression. The ice cracked. Jackson slowly pulled his forearm away from Mark's throat. He holstered his weapon. Mark collapsed onto the concrete, sobbing in pain and relief, clutching his mangled hand. Jackson didn't look at him again. He turned and walked toward me. He took off his own suit jacket, wrapping it around my shoulders over the coat, pulling me against his chest. He was warm, solid, and smelled of ozone and gunpowder. "It's over," Jackson whispered into my hair. "You're safe." From the shadows, 6 men emerged, moving silently. 2 of them hauled Mark roughly to his feet, zip-tying his uninjured hand behind his back, dragging him away into the fog. The nightmare was finally ending. The morning sun broke over the city skyline, painting the clouds in bruised hues of purple and gold. I stood on the balcony of Jackson's penthouse, a mug of black coffee warming my hands, watching the city awaken below. The events of the night before felt like a fever dream, sharp and fragmented. The ledger had been recovered. Mark was gone, handed over to associates who would ensure he never returned to the city. His debts paid in a currency Jackson had shielded me from knowing. My mother was safe. I was free. I heard the slide of the glass balcony door. Jackson stepped out into the crisp morning air. He was wearing dark slacks and a white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up, revealing the heavy ink of tattoos snaking up his forearms. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes deeper than ever, but the intense, coiled tension that had defined him for the past week had loosened slightly. He walked over and stood beside me, leaning his forearms on the glass railing, looking out at the horizon. "My men will drive you to your mother's house in an hour," he said quietly. "Your apartment lease has been paid for the next year. I've set up an account in your name. It holds enough to keep you comfortable while you figure out what you want to do next." I looked at him, startled. "Jackson, I can't take your money. I didn't do this for a payout." "It's not a payout, Zoe," he replied, finally turning his head to meet my gaze. "It's an apology. I pulled you into a world you never should have seen. I endangered your life. It's the least I can do." I looked down at the coffee in my mug. The truth was, I had pulled myself into his world the moment I grabbed his hand in that diner. It had been an act of desperation, a collision of two vastly different universes. We had forged a bizarre, terrifying partnership out of necessity, bound by a shared enemy, but the enemy was gone, and the necessity had evaporated. "What happens to you now?" I asked. Softly, a shadow passed over his pale eyes. "I go back to work. The ledger is secure, but the Moretti family will test my borders. The war doesn't end. It just changes fronts." I nodded slowly, a profound sadness settling in my chest. In another life, under different circumstances, perhaps there could have been something between us. I felt an undeniable pull toward him, a strange comfort in his dark, protective gravity. But I wasn't built for his world. I couldn't survive in a life where violence was a currency and paranoia was a requirement. I wanted quiet diners, boring mornings, and safety. He belonged to the shadows. I belonged to the light. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "for saving me twice." Jackson reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was lingering, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken connection humming between us. "You saved yourself, Zoe," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. "You are far stronger than you realize. Never forget that." He stepped back, breaking the contact. The physical distance between us immediately felt like a chasm. "Goodbye, Zoe," he said. He turned and walked back inside the penthouse, the glass door sliding shut with a quiet, final click. I stood on the balcony, watching the sun rise higher, illuminating the vast, indifferent city. I was entirely alone, but for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. The waitress had grabbed a stranger's hand to survive, and in doing so, she had found the strength to finally let go. Zoe's journey from a terrified waitress hiding from her past to a woman who outmaneuvered a mobster highlights a profound moral truth. Our most desperate, impulsive choices often force us to confront the exact fears we are running from. By stepping into the crossfire, Zoe didn't just survive. She reclaimed her agency, proving that true power doesn't come from a gun or a syndicate, but from the courage to face the dark and refuse to break. If you enjoyed this intense, slow-burn thriller of survival and hidden worlds, please leave a like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more cinematic, real-life feeling dramatic tales.